What is going on, everybody? Welcome into the reveal of the number 24 team in my 2024 NFL Power Rankings with a deep dive into the Las Vegas Raiders, a frisky and fun team that I'm excited to talk about here today. Based on the comments, I think for the first time that I can remember, I'm at least a little bit higher on the Raiders than many. This is, like I said, a frisky team that has an identity as a bunch of ass kickers, some underrated talent that can hit you in different ways that is a handful to deal with. And even though I don't think this team is a major player in the AFC, obviously ranking them 24th, I think this is a team that's going to pull off some upsets this season that we did not see coming. But before we do dive into this team, I do ask if you could take just a second to hit that like button. If you've been enjoying this series or you enjoy this video, it really does go a long way towards helping support my channel and this series. A lot goes into these videos. It takes just a second to hit that like button, and it really does help. So thank you, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of these deep dives as we lead up to my number one team heading into next season. But let's go ahead and get started by taking a look at this team's offseason, what all changed, where they got better, where they got worse. Starting with the coaching staff, it really is a continuation of what already changed last season. They looked at how much better and how much more physical this team was under Antonio Pierce and said, yeah, we'll take a little bit more of that, please. But they did make some changes beyond that, some for the better, some potentially for the worse. I think as far as the offensive coordinator change, very much to be determined. They say goodbye to Mick Lombardi, who I can't say did a horrible job given the existing roster talent last season and how the offense performed. And they bring in Luke Getsy, who Chicago fans will laugh at Raiders fans for that. I am willing to give Luke Getsy a second chance here, calling plays for Justin Fields, who consistently misses first reads and is slow to first reads and very rarely gets to second reads. When you scheme up a good play, very often Justin Fields was not able to hit that. So I'm willing to give Luke Getsy a second chance, but there was a lot of ugliness from the play calling side of things in Chicago too. So an interesting hire. They do also bring in the very experienced Marvin Lewis as an assistant head coach here, someone that's done it before and can be a left-hand man for Antonio Pierce. I think that's a very fun and notable hire. But the big one here, and the main reason I don't list this as an upgrade for the staff, is they lose their offensive line coach, Carmen Bricillo, someone we praised a lot in that Giants deep dive. The offensive line coach is an all-important coach in the building. And I don't know what led to this change, but they're going with a much less proven James Craig. And it will be interesting to see if the offensive line can really continue to overperform as they have in years past under Carmen Bricillo. So I'm going to leave the overall coaching as neutral. You get a full season of Antonio Pierce and not a half season of Josh McDaniels, so that's a big thing. But I think the offensive line coach change is substantial enough for me to say we're going to leave this as neutral. Then at quarterback, going to say slightly upgraded. Jimmy Garoppolo was so bad for this team last year and only played a third of their snaps. And they bring in Gardner Minshew. We'll obviously talk a lot more about Gardner when we get to the quarterback breakdown here for the deep dive. But I'm going to say slightly upgraded in the quarterback room. At running back, got to be downgraded. They lose Josh Jacobs to the big contract to the Green Bay Packers. All they did to supplement that was bring in Alexander Madison, who was a bit of a tough watch last season, and the 6th-round pick Dylan Laub out of New Hampshire. Obviously counting on Zamir White to step up there, but got to say downgraded based on the talent base. At tight end, definite upgrades. They spend that 1st-round pick on the ultra-talented Brock Bowers, who you could argue also should be factored in as an upgrade with the wide receiver room with how they're supposed to use him. But we're going to just keep that in the tight end group for now. They also bring in Harrison Bryant, a very nice tight end 3 at this point. And they lose Austin Hooper. So very much upgraded with the tight ends. Wide receiver, again, just to keep things clean here, with Brock Bowers listed as a tight end, going to say neutral at wide receiver. They let Hunter Renfrow go. They bring in some veteran depth in Michael Gallup and Jalen Guyton. Shouldn't be too much of a shift there with that wide receiver room from what they had last year. And then on the offensive line, Gotta say, to be determined, they are losing the right side of their offensive line in right guard and right tackle, two guys that played exceptionally well last year. When I referred to this offensive line exceeding expectations, you look at those names in Jermaine Illuminor and Greg Van Roten, not very well-known or high-paid players, but they certainly played above that pay grade last season. But they brought in a hefty list of additions as well. The talented Jackson Powers Johnson should take one of those guard spots as a second-round pick. I like DJ Glaze in the third round as a tackle prospect. And then some very capable backups in Cody Whitehair, interior flexibility, and Andrews Pete, who after a decade of, for some reason, playing guard at 6'7", kicked out and played tackle for the Saints last year. They signed him as tackle depth here. So a lot of names brought in here, and I think there is very much a world where this is actually a better offensive line than it was last year. But it is going to open up some questions based on how well Van Roten and Illuminor played last season. Then to the defense. Not a ton of movement here, a lot of day 3 picks to fill out the depth, but they did make that big splash on the interior of the defensive line, a position group that very much needed it, in getting Christian Wilkins, the highest paid free agent this cycle. Obvious upgrades on the interior of the defensive line. They do lose Bilal Nichols and Jerry Tillery, who were not horrible for them last year, but obviously that's a big deal bringing in Wilkins. The edge room, however, was completely untouched, leaving that as neutral, as well as the linebacker group. The only thing they did there was bring in Tommy Eichenberg in the 5th round as a depth piece for now. And then in the cornerback room, this one was tough to say. They lost a pair of starters from last season. Amik Robertson goes to Detroit. He was okay for them. And then Marcus Peters, yes, they cut him late last season, but he did play 2/3 of this team's snaps. So if we're comparing this group to last year's group, you have to consider Marcus Peters there. And the only additions to the group came on day 3 in the talented but raw Decamarion Richardson and MJ Devonshire. So they're counting on the existing talent to step up there in that cornerback room. Guys who, as we'll see later, are, I would argue, less proven than guys like Amik Robertson and Marcus Peters. But I can't say that this is for sure going to be a downgrade because this defense played really well down the stretch with some of those guys after they had cut Marcus Peters. So going to say, difficult to say on that. Could be better, could be worse. Safety group staying neutral. Again, all they did was add Trey Taylor in the 7th round of the draft. And then the special teams untouched for good reason. They have the best kicker-punter duo in the league. So if in your offseason the only true downgrade you had was at running back, that's typically going to be a pretty good offseason for most teams. And I would say for the Raiders, they did a good job to kind of push this, I would say, competitive window, not a championship window, but push this competitive window forward. I think last year they surprised me in establishing a better roster talent base than I certainly gave them credit for heading into the season. And I think they're looking to continue that in a bit of a competitive rebuild here for the Raiders that I can't really argue with based on how tough they were last year. But before we break down this roster in complete depth, let's talk about this coaching staff, how they rank and stack up against the rest of the league, as well as what this team is going to look like schematically on both sides of the ball. And we will start with Antonio Pierce, who very much deserved this shot as the head coach. Though it came seemingly out of nowhere, they spent a lot of time wondering if Antonio Pierce is, let's just face it, qualified to become the official head coach of this team. Obviously, his biggest qualification was the fact that this team rallied behind him as the head coach. But beyond that, he had just 2 years of experience as a coach in the NFL, and it was as a linebackers coach, so had never even reached the coordinator level. Did, of course, play in the NFL for 8 seasons. Had a heck of an impressive career after coming into the league in 2001 as an undrafted free agent linebacker. But obviously a lot to consider anytime you're hiring a coach that isn't necessarily a mastermind on either side of the ball. He obviously has a defensive background. He can coach linebackers and did an incredible job with these linebackers on this roster. But if your coach is not going to bring that kind of X's and O's schematic advantage that the majority of head coaches in the league do bring, he better bring something else to the table. And with Antonio Pierce, it is that rah-rah sort of team builder mentality, culture builder mentality that really worked for this Raiders team. They formed an identity under this coach, and it just reached a point where they couldn't really risk losing that identity because it became this team's biggest asset. And that identity is that of an ass-kicking football team, really capped off by that win over the Chiefs, where they just punched them in the mouth on both sides of the ball, ran the piss out of the football. And anytime you can decleat the Chiefs in this division, it's going to open some eyeballs. So I definitely felt like bringing Antonio Pierce back, at least for another year to see where this goes, was the right decision. Is he ultimately the highest upside coach for the long haul? Obviously, very to be determined. I don't want to say yes or no at this point. I definitely lean towards the idea of, hey, give me that schematic genius, preferably on the offensive side of the ball. So I would argue the odds are against him here, but I'm a big fan and a big fan of what he accomplished last year. I do rank him as the 24th best head coach in the NFL. And in terms of that overall coach and culture ranking, it is actually a little bit higher than where the Raiders as a team came in, with a B- grade, 19th to 23rd. But of course, anytime you have a CEO style of head coach, it's going to ultimately come down to the coordinators to give you some sort of X's and O's advantage. And let's start with the offensive side of the ball, as this team is going to make a shift towards Luke Getsy, who has spent the last couple of years in Chicago after really being groomed under Matt LaFleur before that, and definitely a coach that runs that very typical wide zone, play action heavy, Shanahan, McVay style offense. A well-documented scheme at this point, and I would expect a lot of those principles to carry over to the Raiders offense here. And I do think that's interesting because in terms of the running backs in place, specifically with Zamir White, I don't know that he's necessarily the best outside zone runner. I like him much better between the tackles on gap and duo. And in terms of having a quarterback that's going to take make the most out of play action deep shots, I don't know that specifically Gardner Minshew is the best guy for that type of scheme. I like Minshew in more of a spread them out, pick them apart style offense, running a lot of RPOs. And how much Luke Getsy is able to sort of thread this offense together, thread those differences together, is going to be really defining of what Luke Getsy's, frankly, career could look like, because you don't get a lot of third chances in this league. And I think Getsy can look at some of his sort of ancestors or mentors, if you will, in LaFleur, McVay, Shanahan, in their more pivot towards gap run games, do more of that here with this Raiders team than he did in Chicago, and have success with that, as well as taking a look at really what Shane Steichen did with Gardner Minshew, running more quick-hitting RPOs, tapping into the skill set of someone like Brock Bowers, who this team just drafted. Those are things that didn't necessarily exist in his iteration of Justin Fields' offense, that I'm hoping he can kind of reshape his playbook in the right way. One nice thing here is he's reunited with Devontae Adams, who, at least under Matt LaFleur, did an exceptional job of moving him around, finding ways to isolate him to get one-on-one looks, because he is still one of the more double-teamed wide receivers in the league. So you're hoping some of that stuff can carry back over from years ago. Ultimately, I don't have Luke Getsy ranked all that favorably. He is tied for the worst grade in the league for pass game coaching. Obviously, a very harsh grade there. My stance on that is, while Justin Fields has his issues as a quarterback and is not a simple quarterback to scheme up a passing game for, there was still a lot of ugliness from the play calling side from Luke Getsy, and I think is very much unproven in terms of scheming up the passing game. But I do rank the Raiders much more favorably in terms of run game coaching, with a B- grade, really kind of smack dab in the middle of the league, 12th to 17th in terms of the rankings. Luke Getsy has orchestrated some good run games in Chicago. But on top of that, the existing staff here for the Raiders did do a really good job scheming up the run game, and I think you'll see some carryover there as well to help out Luke Getsy, so a little bit more favorable there. But then in terms of the defensive coordinator here, Patrick Graham, this to me is, with all due respect to Antonio Pierce, the biggest asset in this coaching staff that the Raiders have. I'm a big fan of Patrick Graham. I put the up arrow on him because I think he is destined for a head coaching opportunity, very likely elsewhere at this point, because it's pretty unlikely that they would move on from Pierce and promote Patrick Graham. But he was getting head coach interviews this offseason. Rightfully so. It goes back to orchestrating some really overachieving defenses with the Giants. And then with this Raiders team, he's done a phenomenal job. And he runs a very, very adaptable, multiple defense. For those that watched the Patriots schematic breakdown talking about the 3-3-5 base defense that the Patriots run, I think a lot of those influences came from what Patrick Graham did with the New York Giants. And the Raiders under Patrick Graham will run a lot of that 3-3-5 or 5-1 front stuff. But with the personnel they've had, it hasn't always made sense for the Raiders. And Patrick Graham has gone in other directions, still using a wide variety of different fronts. Sometimes they're having their edge rushers put their hands in the dirt. Sometimes they're standing up. He does a very good job mixing things up as well in terms of when he's blitzing, when he's not blitzing. But he also does a really good job mixing up the types of coverages he's going to call, even though he stems from completely different backgrounds, much more of a man-style defense under Bill Belichick and even under Steve Spagnuolo, a lot more of that press man mentality. Spent time in more of a, fire zone, blitz-heavy 3-4 system under Mike Pettin, but has run completely different stuff in his recent years. With the Giants, he was a very cover 3 heavy play caller, and then with the Raiders here, last year, they actually ran a ton of 2-shell stuff. They were very high in terms of cover 4, cover 6, and cover 2. Those made up about 50% of their coverage calls. And then they ran a lot of off-zone, cover 3, pattern match, 3-seam stuff. Basically, everything he could call to protect his cornerback room, which was really smart. He looked at the guys he had, and he was like, I can't do the press man stuff that I used to do with some of these other coordinators. And hell, when he was with the Giants, that was the same deal. They didn't have a ton of cornerback talent. But he's really proven that he can coach and communicate and mix up these zone calls on the back end to present a lot of confusion and different challenges for opposing offenses. So a very complex, multiple, adaptable scheme that takes a really good teacher, coach, and communicator to pull off that sort of defense, and Patrick Graham has shown that he can do that. So I definitely, again, view him as one of the ascending defensive minds in the league. And in terms of ranking him, there's a lot of great defensive coordinators in the league right now. So his 19th to 22nd ranking for pass game coaching might sound harsh, but that is with a very firm B grade. And then the run defense coaching a little bit higher, again, a B grade, but in that massive cluster in the middle of the league, ranking 11th to 26th. When you really break this down, there's a lot of really good defensive coaches in the league right now. So those head coach opportunities are a little bit harder to come by, and even a really good coach like Patrick Graham might not stand out in terms of the rankings there, but obviously someone I really like. Overall, it's a fun staff, every piece with something to prove, and definitely a trio of dudes that I'm pulling for this season. But let's get to the player side of things, breaking down each position group, how they rank against the rest of the league, and that will start with the quarterback room. The quarterback room that all of you that think the Raiders are ranked too high are going to be pointing to and saying, look at that group with Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell. How the hell is a team with those quarterbacks ranked as the 24th team in the league? And I do agree with some of that sentiment. I have the Raiders ranked 27th at quarterback for passing grade. They ended up 29th in terms of the overall quarterback ranking once you factor in the run multiplier, where these guys are very static, don't give you anything in that regard. And I think you could even argue that they could finish even lower than that, considering most of the guys ranked below them are young, hopefully ascending passers, right? But a couple of things here. Number one, I do think the Raiders, as far as justifying their overall team ranking, have done a very good job to build a team identity and to establish talent that can work around a point guard style quarterback. We'll look at the weapons in a little bit, but they want to run the ball. They should play really good defense this year. They have a approach to winning that frankly worked late last season with an Aiden O'Connell, worked for Gardner Minshew and the Colts last year, who went 7-6 on that team, and is an approach that can work if you're looking to be that frisky underdog type of team that makes for a really hard out every single week. But then the other side of things here is I think I am just a little bit higher on Gardner Minshew than I see a lot of people talking about him. Not a lot higher. I'm not a psychopath. I mostly understand what Gardner Minshew is, but I think he's very much earned this opportunity, and ranking him, who I do project to be the week 1 starter for this team, despite the people in Aiden O'Connell's camp, but ranking him 27th in the league as a passing quarterback is giving him his dues as a guy that has done it in the NFL and, again, has earned this opportunity. Now, I know this could be viewed as handpicking some stats here, but if you could throw out a 2020 season with the Jags where this team was actively working against Gardner Minshew, a team that very much wanted the number 1 pick to get Trevor Lawrence that year, they benched Gardner Minshew because they were afraid he was good enough that he might win them a game or two that loses them Trevor Lawrence. If you could throw that season out and throw out a Week 18 start with the backups on the Eagles in 2022, where the team lost 52-26, Gardner Minshew is a 500 quarterback throughout his career. And I'm not a QB wins guy, far from it, but I think that does mean a little bit more for a potential game manager, bridge starter type of guy, as opposed to if we're nitpicking and debating elite quarterbacks, right? The fact of the matter is Gardner Minshew has won his fair share of games in the NFL and did it just last season for a Colts team that had similar talent. Remember, they were a Week 18 win against the Texans away from going to the playoffs last year, mostly with Gardner Minshew. And when you look at who he is as a quarterback, I've pointed to the fact that they want a point guard, someone that can run an NFL offense, get through his progressions, go from 1 to 2 to 3 quickly, for the most part, to get the ball where it's supposed to go on time, specifically in the short to intermediate game, and lean on a group of good weapons to do a lot of the work for him. They also want the run game to be a large focus of this offense, and as we hinted at with Luke Getsy, I'm really hoping that they can tap into the RPO game, the run pass option, where they're going to lean on the run game, but they can have elements baked into this offense, just as Gardner Minshew really thrived in Shane Steichen's offense in Indianapolis. Read the leverage of defenders, and if they overcommit to the run or are out of position, you can fire that slant to Devontae Adams. You can flip the ball out to a Brock Bowers, who's a menace after the catch. Be, quite literally, a point guard for this offense. And then the thing that Gardner Minshew brings to the table that I think sets him above Aiden O'Connell in this debate is third down playmaking. That is where I think I do end up a little bit higher in Gardner Minshew, where even going back to his rookie season in Jacksonville, even if he is one of the least, if not the least physically capable starter in the NFL right now, in terms of mobility and arm talent, he has those instincts to feel the rush, to navigate the pocket, to use his feet when he needs to, buy time to create throwing windows and high percentage looks down the field. He has a little bit of a playmaking it factor about him. Now, because of the lack of arm talent, he will put the ball in harm's way much more than those high-ranking quarterbacks. Some of it is he tries throws that his arm lets him down on, and the ball can't quite get where he needs it to go. And some of it is he does have accuracy issues. As much as we overrate arm talent, it does help you command the football, and as long as your mechanics are good, theoretically it should lead to good accuracy. But when you can't command that football, it does increase your margin for error, and that does work against Gardner Minshew. But if you're talking about a guy that on first and second down, he can play point guard, distribute the ball, make the right reads, and then on third down, if you get in a tough 3rd and 8, you have a guy that can actually make a play and move the chains and keep a drive alive, that's very Alex Smithian, right? You can win football games with that formula if things go right around them. And I think they look at some of that playmaking, and that's why they signed him as opposed to Aiden O'Connell, which is a good transition to Aiden, who, while I'm not projecting to start here, I will admit was much better than I expected as a rookie. I really questioned why this team benched Jimmy Garoppolo and went to Aiden O'Connell. And for the first few games, I was tooting my own horn saying, I told you so. They should go back to Jimmy Garoppolo, but they stuck with it. And as the season went on, O'Connell got more comfortable and he actually started to make some really nice throws, had some pretty nice games in there. But there are some things that really hold him back. He, like Gardner Minshew, really lacks physical tools. Definitely feels like a quarterback that you kind of know over time is going to settle in as a backup caliber guy. I think his arm talent is actually a little bit better than Gardner Minshew, but that's not saying much. If he were the week 1 starter, he would still be towards the bottom 3 or 5 in the league in terms of raw arm talent. He's not an athlete, and especially when you talk about the creativity to make something happen when there is nothing there, it's non-existent. He doesn't have a pocket feel. He takes bad sacks. He very seldom breaks out of the pocket, gets into scramble drill, and seldom gives you second reaction plays that, again, I think they really are excited to get some of that with Gardner Minshew. And then the other thing is, like, he's still very young. I don't think he has the processing of a Gardner Minshew quite yet to consistently hit the first read. Granted, it was probably above average for a rookie quarterback, but still a ways to go in that department in terms of pushing the ball into harm's way in the structure of the offense. He's just young. And I think Minshew gives you a little bit more in that department. But to finish this by giving Aiden O'Connell some credit, I think in terms of pushing the ball downfield, maybe tapping into guys like Davante Adams and Trey Tucker further down the field. And if this is going to be more of that play-action shot style offense, as low as I was on Aiden O'Connell's arm talent, he is probably a better deep ball passer than Gardner Minshew. So if that really is the style of offense that they want, if Luke Getsy wants to be a Shanahan-style offense, I think O'Connell is probably a better fit for that. Whereas if they want to do more of the quick distributing stuff, the pass game in a lot of ways as a part of the run game, as we described with RPOs and that kind of stuff, I think Gardner Minshew is the guy. So I think you get the point. It's not the highest ranking quarterback room, but as we transition to the weaponry here, you can start to see how this thing might work. I have them ranked very well in terms of weaponry, with a B+ grade in a cluster ranking 6th to 12th in the NFL. A lot of teams have good groups of weapons. That's where the league is going, but the Raiders are one of those teams. And my favorite thing about this group is not just that they have high-end talent, but how often do I talk about complementary skill sets? Everybody having their role and being put in a position to succeed relative to their skill sets. Every single piece on this Raiders offense makes complete sense to me. And you frankly have pretty much every archetype you could ask for in a group of weapons with this team's starters. You have your alpha, your number 1 wide receiver, Davante Adams, who, even though he is 32 years old, is a wide receiver that has never relied on speed as a player. But even then, he can still run. He still separated deep last season, and it was just very hit or miss in terms of, I mean, if you look at like the first 6 weeks of the season, he was burning dudes, and Jimmy Garoppolo was just missing him. So that led to a drop-off in production, but he still made a ton of plays as the season went on. The only reason I do have a down arrow on Davante Adams and probably wouldn't put him in that true tier one of absolutely elite wide receivers at this point is the age and the fact that his hands were underwhelming last season. There was a point around midseason where he was like, hey, Raiders, feed me. You got to funnel the offense through me. And they would do that. And he actually had some drops in big moments that was like, dude, you can't go out and demand the football and then not come down with catches that you have for the last 4 years. And he had 9 drops registered to him last season. He had 11 over the last 3 years combined. So 9 out of his 20 drops since 2019 came last season. His contested catch win rate also plummeted. He has averaged a 47% contested catch win rate over the last 3 seasons, is 42% on his career, and was down to a 35% last season. So a few more times, counting on him to win those tough catches, he wasn't doing it. So it could just be a outlier season in terms of the ball skills relative to his career, or he could be getting older and isn't quite what he used to be. But that's really the knocks. I still see a ton of separation. I still see an elite route runner, that elite release off the line of scrimmage, and someone that can threaten the defense to all 3 levels and be that true number 1 wide receiver for this team. So that role, that box is checked. Then you have Jakobi Meyers, who fills your physical slot wide receiver role. And he was really good last season to the point that he actually stepped outside and had some wins to the perimeter that we've really never seen for Jakobi Meyers. But for the most part, you are going to want him in the slot, running digs, slants, crossing routes, someone that is tough after the catch. He's smart to sit down in zones. And I actually didn't realize Jakobi Meyers has some of the best contested catch win percentage, frankly, I've ever seen. Now, his contested catches are typically slants and digs where a guy is a half second behind him and kind of draped over him. So it's different than like a T. Higgins or Devontae Adams or Mike Evans. But Jakobi Meyers is a career 62% contested catch ball winner and has never been below 52%. So he is ultra reliable over the middle of the field. I went to compare that to some similar style pass catchers in terms of the type of routes that they're typically targeted on. Michael Thomas was the closest thing I could come to there, was at 60%. Tyler Boyd at 52%, Travis Kelce at 50%. So in terms of throw the ball out in front of this dude, let him come down with a tough catch, he's extremely reliable, even if he isn't the best athlete in the world. And then what else do you need? How about a deep threat? Trey Tucker showed last season that he can absolutely be that guy. 17.4 yards per catch on 34 targets last season. And 15 of those 34 targets came in the last month of the season. So a rookie last season that got comfortable as the year went on, was a little bit older coming out of Cincinnati, and with that age came a little bit more experience in terms of route running and some of the experience to be a little bit more than a deep threat. He made some tough catches towards the sideline in that last month of the season. So I think the arrow is very much pointing up on Trey Tucker. I think he showed everything you could have hoped for a 3rd-round pick. And for what you need him to be within this offense, as someone that is going to see probably the 5th most targets on this team, most of those targets will come deep, and they will probably be high percentage open targets because they'll scheme up deep looks, and it'll be, okay, if he's open, throw it. So you don't need the guy to be a superstar. You don't need him to be anything other than what he is. But within the confines of this offense, he makes total sense, and I love the fit. And then you get to your 2 tight ends, and this is really where the whole thing comes together because, as we've talked about, they want to run the ball. They want to play point guard. They want to use RPOs and distribute the ball in the short to intermediate game especially. And having the flexibility to come out with both of these players, I would bet the house that the Raiders lead the NFL in 12 personnel this year. in that both these guys will be out there. That will take Trey Tucker off the field quite a lot. But the fact that the Raiders could, at any given moment, come out and smash you with 2 tight ends. You have a guy in Brock Bowers that I think can block in line, but is lethal in terms of being a wing blocker for outside zone to reach outside linebackers and safeties. You can go split zone and have him go cross formation. You can go with a strong eye formation and use him as a fullback. And then from any number of those alignments, he can come out and receive handoffs. You can flip the ball out to him in the flat. You can run an RPO off a slant. You can go Y leak and get him lost. There are so many possibilities with this combination. This pick was criticized by some because it's like, oh no, Michael Mayer is useless now. No, Michael Mayer is a essential piece of this because it allows Brock Bowers to be the elite playmaking weapon that he frankly has the potential to be as a rookie. Because if you just took Brock Bowers to be, okay, you're our true starting tight end, you're going to line up in line a bunch, you're not going to be putting him in a position where he can be really, as I project, a top 5 run after catch weapon in the National Football League the second he touches the field. And that's not even mentioning putting him out as a slot wide receiver where he is a monster running routes on 2-way goes. He was just one of the best football players in the draft, but fell to the 13th spot because it was a usage question and he needed to find the right fit. I think he absolutely did with the Raiders. And to put that role on top of 3 very logical, well complementary skill sets, if that makes sense, as we broke down with the wide receivers, it just is, frankly, a thing of beauty in terms of how this thing is constructed. And then you get to Michael Mayer, who we've hinted at is an essential piece of the puzzle here. He's their wide tight end. And to me, that is exactly who Michael Mayer is. Full-size tight end, a willing, technically sound blocker that should only get better here in year 2. A really nice run-after-catch threat, will win tough contested catches, just as he did last season. Even though he split time basically evenly with Austin Hooper and only had 304 yards in his rookie season, he was 5 for 9 on contested catches. I think we saw everything in the flashes in which they used him to believe that he is a very capable tight end. Not the fastest guy, not going to be the best separator in the world, but you literally do not need those skills from him when you have everybody else in here. And his existence allows you to, again, open up Brock Bowers. So, frankly, I was so pleasantly surprised to kind of break this group down and project this as really one of the potential best group of weapons in the NFL. And I think once you get past that elite crop of weapon rooms, if you will, from San Fran, Miami, Philly, Minnesota, the Raiders might be 5th in terms of just pure upside. If Brock Bowers can be what we described, if Mayer and Tucker can take leaps in year 2, maybe Devontae Adams splits the difference between the drop-off he had last year and what he was in 2022 for the Raiders. This could be a really, really special group. And if you want to know how the Raiders rank 24th, this group is a huge part of that. Now, we didn't really mention the running backs. They'll play their hand here. I still expect Amir Abdullah, at least early on, to be the primary third down running back. He's a very good pass protector. He is really established within this role at this point. He's got sure enough hands. He runs good routes. He's capable in this role. But they did draft Dylan Laub, who has a chance to be a more juiced up version of an Amir Abdullah. Runs really good routes, was hyper productive at New Hampshire. I think for the long haul, Dylan Laub has a chance to be something like a Darren Sproles, Danny Woodhead, all the way up to, Austin Eckler, maybe. Eckler had a little bit more size and power in the run game, but that kind of premium receiving back, maybe what Tariq Cohen was when healthy, that type of dude. I think Dylan Laub has the skill set to surprise as a 6th round pick and just provide another headache that makes sense within the structure of this offense, right? So they got pieces. And then Zamir White will be back there. He's actually been better than you might have expected in the receiving game. looked effective on 17 targets last season, but still kind of learning how to pass protect, and does not bring the sort of route running prowess. But in terms of the screen game or just flip it out to him in the flat, he can do some stuff there as well. So it'll be a big rotation, I think. Obviously not going to make or break this room. But maybe the nicest thing you can say about those three running backs is Alexander Mattison shouldn't have to touch the field on third down, where he was a disgrace for the Vikings last year. Not only was he widely inefficient, but had 6 drops on targets out of the backfield last year. Now, we do need to talk about the depth before we move on. They did sign Michael Gallup. He, to me, will be a true backup within this offense. Trey Tucker alone is going to be in a rotation with Brock Bowers. So there's only so many snaps to go around here. But as a wide receiver 4 for Michael Gallup, yeah, absolutely. He's had a falling off from being a wide receiver 2 for Dallas. Injuries have certainly caught up with him, but for this role, that's fine. You've got Jalen Guyton, who's a good backup to Trey Tucker as a deep threat. Has had his moments for the Chargers. And then Tulu Griffin, I think, is probably a practice squad stash. But if anything were to happen to either Brock Bowers or Jacoby Myers, and you want to put another guy back into the offense that has really good run after catch ability for some of those RPOs and quick passes, Tulu Griffin, he stood out to me, and I thought he should have been drafted. I thought he was one of those guys where his play speed was much better than his testing speed. So natural at transitioning to runner after catch. Someone that might make this team as a return specialist as well, especially with the new rules. But runs with a full head of steam and is a real handful to get down after the catch. So someone to keep an eye on specifically as a return man in the event of injuries. And then it is a massive competition between undrafted talents that probably won't make the team. And then you've got your backup tight ends. You've got Harrison Bryant. Decent receiving skills, would probably be the Brock Bowers replacement in the event of injuries. Obviously wouldn't see the target share, but in terms of being that undersized wing tight end that could still technically do some of the stuff in the playbook that you do with Brock Bowers, that would be Harrison Bryant. And then Zach Gentry would be your Michael Mayer backup as the kind of blocking inline Y tight end. So there is your group of weapons. In my opinion, an exceptional group, a really fun group. And I'm just excited to see how Luke Getsy makes this thing work. And I'll be a little disappointed if he's not able to be creative with some of these pieces. But we've talked about the emphasis on the run game. Let's talk about the actual running backs here. It's unfortunately not the most dynamic running back room, though I do like Zamir White to an extent. I think he has shown to be as advertised as a third-round pick coming out of Georgia. I compared him to Damian Harris as that kind of straight-line power back that can get the job done at the next level. There's not a lot of rushing creativity, whether that's vision in the backfield when, you know, the block the play isn't perfectly blocked up. He's not gonna make a bunch of guys miss or find a different hole consistently or use light feet to change lanes. That's not really who he is. And then out in space, he's just not very creative. He'll put a stiff arm or a truck on you. He'll fight for 2 or 3 yards. Sometimes he'll show contact balance and break a tackle, but very much a no-nonsense north and south runner. They leaned on him late in the last season, and he produced. There's been plenty of positive reviews about him early in the offseason. You look at how this team wants to come out and approach this offense. I think he will see a high workload, and I actually really like him for fantasy football. Just took him in my subscriber dynasty league, and for any sort of redraft formats, or if you're playing on Underdog Fantasy, our sponsor for today's video, if you want to draft Zamir White, I say do it. I see no less than 12 carries a game for Zamir White, which by today's standards are very good. I think his 4.3 yards per attempt last season sounds about right to me. So you're looking at 50 to 60 yards a week with some potential for, 20, 30-yard chunk runs in there and a lot of touchdown potential as well, because he's the guy they're going to go to at the goal line. The type of back to me that they ride out for these 2 remaining years on his rookie contract and then maybe look to either get him back for cheap or replace him. Now, they did sign Alexander Mattison. there's going to be the threat that he's going to eat into Zamir White's workload here. But unless he shows to be a dramatically better running back than he was last season, I think this team is going to have a hard time looking at Alexander Mattison as anything other than a true backup, maybe only getting 2 or 3 touches a game, especially if you think this is going to be, as we've described, an RPO-heavy offense where a lot of those quick-hitting passes are an extension of the run game, where if you use some mental gymnastics, some of those Jacoby Myers, Brock Bowers, Devontae Adams targets towards the sideline or quick-hitting RPOs are, in a way, handoffs. You factor those in. You factor in that Abdullah and Laub should play a role on third down. I don't think Zamir White's going to be getting too tired or give this team too much of a reason to take him off the field on those early downs. So Mattison struggled last year, and he's a similar style back to Zamir White, but just doesn't have the ability to hit a hole as hard as Zamir White and doesn't have the power at the point of contact that Zamir White has. So I'm just not too afraid of Alexander Mattison as I draft Zamir White in my fantasy leagues. I think this is mostly White's backfield. Now, in terms of ranking this group relative to other running back rooms in the league, it just doesn't rank that high. Zamir White is very much unproven. I think he's a capable back. Should be a very good starter for them, but does have a lack of upside with some of the lack of creativity and overall athleticism. And then not having any really notable threats after that. That's where you get this running back room having a C grade, ranking 28th to 30th in the league. I do think they produce more than that because they're going to lean into a guy like Zamir White much more. So that's not where I would rank him in terms of fantasy football. But in terms of actual efficiency and level of play relative to the rest of the league that is flooded with good running backs, they rank pretty low there. So he's good enough to allow this team to do what they want to do on the ground, but shouldn't really elevate this run game too much either. And then, as we mentioned, they are getting effectively nothing from the quarterbacks in the run game. So no boost getting added from read options and that sort of thing. But then you look at the offensive line and you're back to a group that's a good contributor to this offense. Ironically, they come out with the exact same total unit grades that we gave the Chargers, a B- in both pass blocking and run blocking, tied with the Chargers for overall offensive line, ranking 11th to 12th. Ironic, of course, because we just did the Chargers, and they're in the same division. But it is a very solid unit with really only one question mark, in my opinion, in Thayer Munford, which we might as well just start there and we'll work right to left. They believe in him, and while I would say he's a question mark, after watching the tape on this team, I was pleasantly surprised by what I saw from Thayer Munford, a 7th-round pick out of Ohio State a couple of years ago, someone I was very low on coming out, but, 7th-round pick out of Ohio State. Why not draft the guy? And he's definitely already exceeded those expectations, but after watching the tape, I can't fully blame the Raiders for saying, I think we can get by with him as our right tackle. And he's still young. There's no reason to believe he can't continue to get better. I would say he has the size, he has the toughness, he clearly has the work ethic and the willingness to get better. He's just missing some of the athletic measures that you would typically like to see for a starting tackle in the league. And ultimately, that will likely reduce his upside long term, and it certainly reduces his pass blocking efficiency currently. That's where the question mark comes in, is with his pass protection, which gets a 67 grade from me. That's in the replacement level tier. He's not what I would describe as a complete turnstile, but he definitely takes his losses, especially when this team asks him to be on an island and block one-on-one. His feet are just very slow. He can lose the edge and he can lose on inside counters. But I think his hands are pretty good. Even when he loses, he's able to kind of, get a grip on a guy and go for a ride and slow a guy down. And his anchor is very good. So there's aspects of him in pass protection that worked. And when he is your only weak link and you have a superstar left tackle, you're able to use a guy like Michael Mayer, Brock Bowers, or slide the offensive line to give the guy help. When you only have one weak link, it's much, much easier to work around that. And we saw that with the Raiders last year. They actually protected really well. And then in terms of run blocking, he has that tenacity. He has the play strength and is a really good downhill blocker. This reminds me a little bit of the Cowboys' right tackle in Terrence Steele, who ended up starting a lot of games as an undrafted talent coming into the league, almost identical size. Year 3, he had a breakout year, got a big contract, and then took a step backwards in year 4. It's a very similar player. And as the Cowboys have shown, you can work with that. So you've got some question marks there, but I was pleasantly surprised there, and they actually have some options as depth as well. Let's just hit on those, considering this is the one question mark. They signed Andrews Pete, who, strangely enough, on the wrong side of 30 after a very well-compensated but abysmal career as a guard for the Saints. They ended up finally playing him at tackle, which is something I've been frankly asking for years because he's 6'7", and I never really saw it from him at guard. But he played tackle, and I thought at least gave them better football than he's given the Saints in a long time there. He is a good run blocker. I think he's, at this point, very good insurance. If you get through 4 weeks and the good games you got from Thayer Munford as a pass protector last year turn out to be a blip, they can very quickly bench him, go to Andrews Pete, and patch that hole. They also draft DJ Glaze, 3rd-round pick out of Maryland. I think the highest upside tackle in this group. I really liked Delmar Glaze, going by DJ apparently. Really fluid athlete, moved much better on film than he ended up testing. I thought he showed a lot of good flashes of tenacity in the run game. If they want to run more wide zone here, and they want more of an athlete at tackle, man, the rest of these 4 guys are really good athletes. If they really want to just reach block all the time and be a wide zone rushing game, I think Glaze might be the best stretch blocker in this tackle room. But he does have to get better with his hands, specifically in pass protection, does not protect his chest, and loses against power quite a lot. So I've got my eye on him. Probably not going to see him here in year 1, but I think was a really good use of a 3rd-round pick in a guy that I think has the traits to someday be a starter. Really good arm length, too, 35 inches. So if he can just improve his hand usage from a technique standpoint, those arms could be a weapon for him. But that basically summarizes your right tackle question mark, and then it's pretty straightforward after that. You have Dylan Parham, who listed on Our Lads right now. They say he's going to switch from left guard to right guard. You could flip these two very easily. It doesn't really make a difference. Perhaps the thinking there is that if Munford is the question mark, you'd rather put the established guy next to him as opposed to the rookie. Could also be the case that Parham's natural position is right guard as opposed to left guard. But either way, I think he's settled in as a very capable guard. He's not the biggest guy. His play strength isn't anything special. But at this point, he's very technically sound. He's a great athlete. I think more wide zone will be extremely easy for him to handle. He's really good at running his feet as a pass protector. It's just some of the play strength stuff you can see lead to some losses in both phases. But a very firm, solid starter in the league. Andre James at center has been really one of the pleasant surprises of this entire Raiders team. He is maybe the only saving grace left on this team from the John Gruden era. I guess him and Colton Miller. But this was John Gruden's dude. Kind of out of nowhere, made him the starting center, and year by year by year, he has just gotten better and better and better. You could even argue the up arrow should be on Andre James because for like 5 straight seasons, he's become a more and more efficient blocker. Very solid player, nearing top 10 center in the NFL category. So I love that. Very versatile player too. He's balanced in terms of play strength and athleticism. So whatever type of run scheme you want to ask him to run here, he can be that pivot point at the center for it. Then you put in Jackson Powers Johnson, presumably as the left guard. Very, very little reason to believe that he can't step in right away and be a capable guard. extremely technically sound and strong pass protector. Also, good play strength, good tenacity as a run blocker. I think his athleticism is NFL adequate. I don't think it's anything special. The only reason he really, quote unquote, fell to the second round is potential injury concerns, but I don't know. It hasn't been there for him in college, and I have no reason to believe he's going to be hurt as a rookie, so I guess we'll see there. And it's not like he fell that far, right? Still goes firmly in the second round, which, I had a first to a second round grade on him, so is that even really a fall? I don't know, but he's a damn good prospect. Has a chance to be like a stud guard or even the long-term center, but I think Andre James has that job for the foreseeable future. Love them kind of doubling down on the whole run game, physicality aspect of this football team, and definitely, assuming he's good, fills out what was the biggest need for this offensive line. So you love that. And then, by the way, they have a franchise superstar left tackle in Colton Miller, who has everything you could possibly ask for. He has the length, he has the size, he has the athleticism, he's got the play strength, he's got the established record of success. Relative to a lot of superstar tackles, he's been extremely durable as well. Missed the last kind of quarter of last season. Nothing you're too worried about here, though. He's 29 years old and has barely missed any time in his entire career. So it's probably not fitting that we talked about him last, because he is their cornerstone piece. They can leave him on an island and slide in other directions, and that is a massive benefit towards everybody's efficiency, but especially someone like Thayer Munford that might have some questions, which we talked about. So a very, very good offensive line, probably an underrated offensive line, especially once you get into the tape and see that Thayer Munford's not that bad. And he's the kind of guy that I typically throw major questions on, and will really go after a team like, hey, why did you not address right tackle to a bigger degree? But I'm just being honest. I really did think the film on him was pretty solid. Now, you got to talk about a little bit more depth there at interior. I like the Cody Whitehair signing. If there are some injury questions on Jackson Powers-Johnson, or if you get halfway through the year and he's really struggling, sometimes these offensive linemen just surprise you and aren't what you thought they were as prospects. If that's the case, you don't want to count on Cody Whitehair, but as an emergency Band-Aid to become your weak link, yeah, this group wouldn't be quite as good, but it's still an adequate depth piece. And Andres Pete as well, for all of his deficiencies as an overpaid starting left guard for the Saints, as a backup guard, it's not so bad. So they have options there as well. And then, it'll probably be a competition for your 9th and 10th offensive linemen between a bunch of unproven pieces. And then you also have to note that they do get contributions from the combination of Michael Mayer and Brock Bowers. I think Mayer is going to take another step up in terms of consistency as a run blocker in year 2. It is just really tough, as good of a prospect as he was as a run blocker. It's just really tough to be a great run blocker out the gate at this position, but plenty of reason to believe he'll at least get the job done there. And then Brock Bowers, digging out a defensive end with his hand in the dirt as a Y tight end. He can do it, but probably not very consistently, depending on the size of the defensive end. But with how he's going to be used here, I think he's going to be borderline a Kyle Juszczyk level blocking threat as a move blocker. When they put him in the slot, he's going to seal that perimeter. He's got to kind of prove that he can accomplish that at the NFL level, and this team has to prove that they use him in the right way before you credit him as this elite perimeter blocking threat. But plenty of reason, again, to believe that can be an asset there. So a very positive outlook for the just blocking and offensive line overall, ranking in the top third of the league. So as you put this whole piece together, it's interesting because you have major questions at quarterback, coaching, even the running back room is kind of unconsequential. You've got your negative sides to this offense, and then you have a really good offensive line and a great group of weapons. To me, that nets them as the 25th best offense in the NFL. 24th in the passing game, 29th in the run game, which I'll admit I was surprised it came out that low, but these kind of the bottom third for rushing offenses are all very tightly knit. But they were 24th in run game DVOA last year with Josh Jacobs, so it's not crazy to see this come in at 29th. But overall, like, there's obviously, it's an offensive league. There's a lot of focus on offense. For them to come in as the 25th best offense with Gardner Minshew at quarterback and a defense that we're about to break down that we think is pretty good, it's a workable offense that, based on matchups and some of the unique pieces that they have to attack you with, can have some really explosive games. I do believe that. But at the end of the day, if you want to play ball control offense and run the ball a bunch, you've got to stay within your own game script and in command of things, and that requires a good defense. So let's talk about this Raiders defense and if they're good enough to get that done so that they can play within the formula that they want to play. And that's going to start up front with a really good Raiders defensive line. I have them ranked with a B+ grade, 7th to 8th overall for defensive line, 9th to 13th in pass rush with a B grade there, and then B+ in terms of run defense, actually ranking 2nd to 4th for D-line run defense. And this unit is, highlighted feels like an understatement, but carried by feels like an overstatement. But what I'm trying to say is Max Crosby is that dude. This dude has checked so many freaking boxes over the last 2 or 3 years. It's honestly unreal. Like, rewind 3 years ago, I wasn't sure that this guy was even a high-end number 2 pass rusher. Then he proved that he's a legit number 1. And then over the last couple of years, really back-to-back years, he has established himself within that elite premium tier, like truly elite number 1 edge rushers, right in the mix, in my opinion, with Micah Parsons, Nick Bosa, and TJ Watt, and of course Myles Garrett. And it has been a true joy to watch him ascend to that level. And where do you want to start with him? We'll just pick somewhere and go from there. I mean, he's an underrated athlete. He's got ideal length. He's got speed. He's got power. All the real physical traits that are required to reach that level of edge defender. But he's got an excellent pass rushing skill set. He'll pull off spin moves and swim moves, and he sets moves up, and he understands how to manipulate tackles and put together a pass rush plan, attack certain matchups. So the perfect blend of traits, finesse, and power as a rusher. But on top of that, I mean, while he's within that elite tier of edge rushers, I might say he's the 5th best pass rusher out of the group. He might be the best run defender out of that group and the best run defending edge rusher in the NFL. And that, of course, comes from traits and football IQ and length and all that stuff. But on top of it all, it's just effort and a motor that never stops with this guy. And at the end of the day, this play style he has as this true demon with his hair on fire, it couldn't be any more perfect of an aesthetic paired with the Raiders brand, him with the tats, the nickname Mad Max. It's just such a joy. He deserves every single bit of praise that he has received. Maybe stopping just short of, was it Rob Ryan that said he's the best defensive player he's ever watched? I'm not going to quite go that far, but he's playing at a Hall of Fame level. And when you have a player like this, who's one of the 5 best defensive players in football, he's going to make up for some holes that this defense might have and elevate this defense to some special heights, just as he's frankly done the last 2 years. I would argue this Raiders defense has overachieved. Him being that game-wrecking numbers changer up front is a massive, massive part of that. So everything starts with Max Crosby, but now it doesn't necessarily have to end with Max Crosby as it did last season, as they go out and sign the highest paid free agent this cycle. I guess you can't quite say that because Kirk Cousins existed, but the highest paid non-quarterback this cycle in Christian Wilkins, who, like Mad Max, is one of the best run defenders at his position. And good luck to anybody trying to run towards, more often than not, the right side of the Raiders defense. But they also might put Christian Wilkins more opposite of Max Crosby and spread out their talent in terms of run defense. But with Wilkins, pound for pound, he might be the best run defender in the league, but he's not Vita Vea or Dexter Lawrence in terms of being that 350-pound super freak in the middle of a defensive line. He is much more quote-unquote average size for a defensive tackle, plays at about 315 pounds, which is plenty of weight to hold his own, to even anchor against double teams, though he's not going to do that quite as well as like a Dexter Lawrence or a Vita Vea. But in terms of pound for pound play strength, specifically within his core and his arms to shed blocks, and his overall technique in terms of pad level, accuracy, and consistency with his hands to stack the inside of an offensive lineman's shoulder pads, and then to peak, to break down the run with his eyes and his mind, and then to deconstruct and get off blocks at the point of attack, especially if he finds himself one-on-one with a guy. Effectively, what we're talking about is the Madden block shed rating. No one should be higher in the NFL than Christian Wilkins. And I think this team quite clearly has the best run defending duo on a defensive line in the league. And that's where you get to being very, very close to the top in terms of overall defensive line run defense, even though they lack depth and have some holes outside of these two guys. If they had good pieces next to these guys, I mean, they would be number one. And probably number one by a decent margin. But we'll get to Kuntz and Jenkins and Butler and Wilson. Needless to say, they're nothing too special in terms of run defense. But as a pass rusher on Christian Wilkins, he's good. Probably a little overrated in that department. I would say, strictly speaking, as a pass rusher, ideally he'd be your third best piece. He's about a 40 pressure, 6 to 7 sack type of guy on an average season. Last year, he did see an uptick in sacks and pressures as Miami had to really get into scheming up some kind of open rush looks and stunts and stuff once those edge rushers went down. But as far as just watching the tape one-on-one, he's just good. He has some power. He has some quickness. He has a slight variety of pass rush moves. He can win with a swim. He can rip through you. It's just there's nothing he does that's overly dominant. He's not that good of an athlete. His first step doesn't give him too much of an advantage in that department. So it's not that he won't help the pass rush. He will. It's not that wasn't a part of like the massive amount of money he got paid. It's a part of his game, but it really is that he is a superstar run defender and a good pass rushing defensive tackle. But that's obviously the focal point of this defense is that duo up front. I do want to return to the edge room as we continue this conversation with Malcolm Kuntz, who I would say from a production standpoint has a chance to be this team's second most productive pass rusher. And if you look at how he played in the second half of the season last year, that should be expected and not controversial at all. And frankly, whether or not that was an outlier, who he is moving forward or somewhere in between, could be a wild card for this defense as a whole, because from week 9 on, this man put up 38 pressures and 8 sacks in the second half of the season. And if you double that throughout the course of a full season, you're talking about someone putting up like low-end number one edge numbers. But in the 8 weeks before that, he had just 14 pressures and no sacks, granted on a decent amount less playing time. And in the first 2 years of his career, after being a third-round pick out of Buffalo, he played just over 100 snaps in 2 seasons. So it took him a long time to get on the field. And in 2022, he had just 2 pressures on 48 pass rush snaps. So again, a huge wild card here in terms of the type of production you're going to get from Malcolm Kuntz. But you watch his skill set, and there's reason to believe that next to Wilkins and Crosby, he can at least be a really good piece of this pass rush, if not more than that, to the point where he ascends to being a good number 2 rusher long-term, opposite of Max Crosby, especially heading into a contract year here with a little extra motivation. But he's got that kind of speedy, bendy, contortionists profile that can just be a real handful for offensive tackles to handle. He's got, of course, the speed and bend and get off to threaten the edge. That becomes a threat on inside counters where his feet are quick enough to do stuff like that. But because he's only 6'2", he's able to get under guys' pads, and whether that's bending through with a rip move with good leverage or actually getting under him for a bull rush, he has that at his disposal and could do that even more efficiently as he gets better at it. So there's a lot to like with him. But it is worth noting here that they don't really trust him, at least yet, in terms of run defense. He's a actually adequate splash play run defender. He actually amounted 27 PFF run stops last year. That was 41st among edge rushers, despite only playing 148 run defense stops. So in terms of finding the ball and making some impact plays as a run defender, they were on tape, but he does have negative plays where his lack of size and inability to really set a hard edge does show up, and I think that is a big reason why they would take him off the field on rundowns. And I think there is also something to be said about keeping him fresh for pass rush downs that helps him sustain that efficiency that he showed as a pass rusher that we talked about. It's not that he can't surprise us and show to be a better run defender. Technically speaking, his size is very comparable to like Samson Ebukam, which he should just be watching Samson Ebukam tape all offseason, because that dude at an identical size is one of the better run defending edge rushers in the league. And there's some similar traits there, but until he earns the respect of the Raiders to be a more consistent run defender, they're going to be looking for different packages to supplement that and different players to play that sort of 5-tech. So you will get some different kind of 5-man fronts and some of those more Belichickian or the 3-3-5 stuff where you're getting guys like maybe Byron Young in year 2 to show what he can do as more of a 5-tech, guys like Adam Butler. But the guy that they're really hoping can take that step is Tyree Wilson, who was the 7th overall pick in last year's draft and was a colossal disaster for this team. But it is too early to just give up on this guy. But what's unfortunate with Wilson, it was both phases where he really struggled. And because we're on this conversation about run defense, let's start there. And that would be such a good starting point for Tyree Wilson to just play 5-tech, play a little 4-eye at times, use that 275-pound frame with great length, play with better pad level, set a hard edge, get off some blocks, make some run stops, become a more trusted piece for this defensive line rotation so that he can start to develop as a pass rusher after that. But it wasn't a huge surprise based on his Texas Tech tape that he just didn't play the run with the intensity that he could at his size and the awareness that he could at his size. At Texas Tech, it felt like guys would just run past his lane all the time and he just wouldn't see the ball. So they got to find a way to coach that into him, because from a traits perspective, there's no reason to believe he can't at least become a big-bodied early down complement to a guy like Malcolm Kuntz as he breaks out. But obviously the hope is that what they drafted him to do, to be the number 2 edge rusher opposite of Max Crosby, I mean, we're not that far removed from talking about how much of a high upside combination this could be. And it's tough to predict it with Tyree Wilson. After last year, he was 109th out of 122 players in pass rush win rate. He really only won with power at Texas Tech and just wasn't able to dominate guys with his strength and athleticism as he was in the Big 12. So it's really hard to predict that leap, but my goodness, if he could get back on track, this could be, a top 3 defensive line in the NFL. But I think as a starting point, it's much more realistic to say, all right, get out there for some dirty work, play the tackle well in run defense, and then, it sounds like they're going to play around with moving them inside as a, pass rushing 3-tech and do some of that stuff with him. That's fine. To me, Tyree Wilson is at his best when he can rush wide and use that length and build up speed to just bulldoze dudes over. I mean, it's a completely different skill set when you're rushing within a phone booth. I don't know if he has the short area twitch to generate that type of pop. In those short areas in between the tackles. So we'll see how that goes as well. But it gets a lot less interesting after that conversation. Next up, we got to bring up both John Jenkins and Adam Butler, two veterans that have seemingly been in the NFL forever at this point. I throw John Jenkins up there as a starter on the main graphic, but Adam Butler plays almost as many snaps as John Jenkins. Jenkins is the much better run defender between the two. Butler is a more useful pass rusher between the two. Also, fun fact, Adam Butler is known as one of the best coverage dropping defensive tackles in the NFL, and they continue to use him like that from time to time. 15 coverage snaps for Adam Butler last year. That was 4th in the NFL last year. But yeah, I mean, John Jenkins is an adequate run defender, but at 35 years old, how much longer are you counting on him? Still played okay last year. It's not like you need a lot of athleticism to be a run defending defensive tackle. It's more about old man strength and effort and stamina for him at this point. So no reason to believe he can't do the same thing he did last year, other than at some point the wheels fall off on these guys. And then Adam Butler, again, had a close to a career year last year as a pass rusher. He did have 28 pressures, 6 sacks. Nothing truly special there, but if you need somebody else next to Christian Wilkins that can at least get you some wins, manufacture some pressure, do some stuff off of stunts, Butler is an adequate piece for that. And until Tyree Wilson shows that he can be that guy that plays and rushes from the interior on passing downs, you're going to need Adam Butler there. So definitely some necessary veteran pieces there that they're hoping they can get exactly what they got out of them last year. And then it's all developmental stuff. Byron Young would be the next guy I'm interested in, especially with what we talked about with Malcolm Kuntz, needing maybe a complementary piece to play a little bit of 5-tech on earlier downs. Byron Young did that at Alabama. He's about 290 pounds, definitely an interior defensive lineman, but a decent athlete, a 3rd-round pick last year. Would not be surprised if he takes a leap as a kind of useful early down quasi-edge piece for this team. Again, pending on what Tyree Wilson gives this team. But he's kind of a capable tweener backup that I don't expect to really emerge as any sort of starter here. They have a couple guys that have been drafted as well in recent years. Matthew Butler, Nesta Jade Silvera. Can they get a jump from those guys? They aren't necessarily counting on it, but it would be really nice. And then off the edge, it is very thin. They really need Tyree Wilson to take that jump. They have Janarius Robinson, a 4th-round pick for the Vikings in 2021, who played 78 snaps for them last year. Charles Snowden, a lanky, undrafted free agent that hasn't really earned any playing time in the league. Ellerson Smith, a mid-round draft pick for the Giants that stunk since he came into the league out of northern Iowa. I almost wonder if this team shouldn't be in the market for just anybody off the edge. I don't have a name to throw at you, but it doesn't have to be a starting caliber guy, but just someone that can eat up 250 snaps in a versatile role for them. But overall, very optimistic conversation for this Raiders defensive line. Again, ranking tied for 7th in the NFL for overall defensive line, and they are definitely going to set the tone for the rest of this defense that's going to be counting on them because it gets a little bit worse. And then even more worse as we get to the 2nd and 3rd levels of the defense. Let's go to that linebacking group, the 2nd level of the defense. It's a very solid, if not unspectacular, duo of linebackers with Robert Spillane and Divine Diablo. They essentially rank smack dab in the middle of the league for linebacker rankings for me. C+ grade in coverage, B- grade in run defense, and the linebacking overall grade came out tied for 16th through 20th. So you start with Robert Spillane, who definitely had a career year last year after coming over from Pittsburgh. Look, I really like Robert Spillane. I think he's a really solid, balanced linebacker, even though he's not some sensational athlete. I think he's got enough athleticism last year he had a borderline Pro Bowl season. Not sure if I'm expecting 3 interceptions from him every year. That was a big selling point in him being in that contention, but definitely an above average starter in the league, especially in terms of run defense, where he's got everything you look for. He's got enough size. He's not some giant smasher, but he has enough size to get dirty in between the tackles, but a quick trigger without losing gap discipline all the time, a consistent tackler. So very good in terms of run defense. And then coverage, I mentioned the 3 interceptions. He does have a knack when he's in those short zones to kind of bait the quarterback. He understands that aspect of things and kind of the timing of quick game and when those underneath throws are coming. But just in terms of the overall athleticism, the amount of space he's able to cover, the depth he's able to get, can he really man guys up? Not really. And for example, he allowed the 13th most yards in coverage last year. So while the splash plays in coverage are fun and the interceptions are nice, it's not all perfect from him. But a very nice player nonetheless. And he's looking like a bargain. They gave him a 2-year, $8 million contract last offseason. And that's a total steal for how he produced for them last year. And then Divine Diablo, played safety at Virginia Tech. He's settled in as a very solid linebacker. I actually was more impressed with his run defense tape than his coverage tape last year, which is not what you would expect for a converted safety. He plays at about 6'3", 225 pounds. He has good sideline-to-sideline speed, but at this point I do feel like he's missing a little something in terms of coverage feel and getting in the way of passing lanes. Kind of lets the quarterback manipulate him and doesn't always play action as well as you'd like. His athleticism does show up as a guy that they can ask to man up tight ends and do a little bit more in terms of coverage than Robert Spillane, but the production certainly isn't where Spillane's is. But then in terms of run defense, he's a little bit on the lighter side in terms of getting off blocks and smashing between the tackles, but very good speed to the ball, very consistent tackler with those long, strong arms that he has. Ultimately, a very nice complement to the more nuanced run defender in Robert Spillane, and rounding out a very solid linebacking duo that helps out this defense. And they have some depth, especially in the run defense department. Luke Masterson has had to play occasionally and actually splashes when he's out there. It's just been a very severe lack of playing time for him, but has shown he can fly around, fly to the ball, help out on special teams, all that stuff. Very unproven as a coverage player, though. And then they do draft Tommy Eichenberg in the 5th round. Very good run-defending college linebacker prospect. One of the more high IQ linebackers you'll see coming out. Not a bad guy to get under Robert Spillane's wings. We mentioned Spillane, 1 year left on that contract. He will be 30 years old next season. So I'm not saying Spillane can't earn a contract extension after this season, but more long term, Tommy Eichenberg is a similar size and just kind of athletic thresholds to a guy like Spillane. So a really good guy to kind of maybe make the long-term replacement there, and definitely a good backup to that guy. So I like that pick. And then Amari Burney, a little bit more of a Divine Diablo backup with just a straight line speedster, loves to run, loves to hit, and that's about it. And then just a competition of like undrafted types after that. So a damn solid linebacking group. But then you get to the secondary, and this is where you are going to have questions about this defense that we've been pretty optimistic about to this point. They have some guys they like here, but in terms of provenness, it's lacking, right? Especially with your top 2 corners in Jack Jones and Jacorian Bennett, or at least your outside corners, because Nate Hobbs is their best cornerback, but he's in the slot. You start with Jack Jones. I would imagine a Raiders fan favorite at this point. They got him for free. He is someone that is very tightly connected to Antonio Pierce, who coached him at Arizona State. Jack Jones is fascinating, where he's kind of been all over the map. He comes out as this day 3, kind of undersized, not the most athletic corner that the Patriots draft. He looks awesome as a rookie, then very quickly falls off with off-field concerns. I want to say he took a gun to the airport or something like that, and then gets basically kicked off the team by the Patriots after, the second half of his rookie season definitely fell off. So they didn't see him as a piece of the future. But Antonio Pierce and the Raiders were like, you know what, we believe in his football character and who he can be for this Raiders team. They pick him up, and really overnight, he was intercepting passes for the Raiders, starting for this team, and was good enough that they just released Marcus Peters. And to be honest, there's a little Marcus Peters in Jack Jones' game where he's not the stickiest coverage player, he's not the fastest guy, but incredible instincts and ball skills to make stuff happen in the secondary. And what you love about Jack Jones is some of his interceptions make it so clear that this dude watches tape and understands offensive tendencies, because he'll jump screens, jump out routes, typically from like off coverage where he's just playing in space, reading the quarterback, reading the offense, and has these kind of game-changing interceptions. So while he's, again, not the guy you want to put press man-to-man and shut down a number 1 wide receiver, he can make plays for your defense, especially when you've got a pass rush up front wrecking havoc like the Raiders can have, speeding up the processing time of the quarterback. You get a playmaker on the back end like Jack Jones, and he can be a dude for you. So he's just a really polarizing guy that's difficult to rank. He's heading into year 3 at 27 years old on his second team, and his starts have been a little bit all over the map. He's had those games where he has very good coverage and takes over with these monster interceptions. And he's had games where teams pick on him, kind of have whatever they want with him, where he's just not always in the best position in terms of one-on-one coverage. So you like to believe in the guy. I think long-term as a sort of, Marcus Peters eventually settled in as like the perfect number 2 corner. If you could have more of a shutdown guy to deal with the best route runner on the other team and funnel, lower percentage throws towards a playmaker like Jack Jones, that would be great. But as their number 1 outside corner, you can definitely have some question marks about that. And then you can definitely have some question marks about Jacorian Bennett having to start opposite of him. I did think Jacorian Bennett was overdrafted, and when he played last year, he certainly wasn't ready. He ran a really good 40 time, but I felt like he was really lacking anticipation and technique in coverage. Watched a lot of him because he was Deonte Banks' running mate at Maryland, and the difference between Deonte Banks' ability to recognize routes, to squeeze space, to stick one-on-one was exponentially better than like Jacorian Bennett. And we saw that for the Raiders. They like to run off coverage, and he just kind of lets that space exist and relies on his speed for recovery and to protect him over the top. But there's just not much there from him in terms of good tape. Frankly, going back to his time at Maryland and definitely last year in 12 games where he started week 1 for this team and eventually got benched. So right now he's the projected starter. I don't think that's anything close to a guarantee because of the, draft investment and the speed. It might be like last year where they're going to stick him out there and see how year 2 goes. But I think it's far from a given that he holds on to that job. I would argue they have at least 2 other corners in the room that are better players than him. They do have Brandon Faison, who continues to get time in the league. Raiders fans are familiar with him. He started a lot of games in 2021 and was not any good. Was a little bit better for the Colts a year after that. But, he's got experience. He's got length. It's about the best thing I can say about him. But he is an option if Bennett truly is a train wreck. The guy I'm definitely interested in, though, is Decamarion Richardson, who I would wager is actually better than Jacorian Bennett right now. And with the opportunity ahead of him, wouldn't be stunned if he beats out Jacorian Bennett. You heard it here first, but this guy's tape was much better than someone like Bennett coming out of the SEC for Decamarion Richardson. He's got better length, he's got better feet, he's got better anticipation, and he's just as fast. Oh, and by the way, Jacorian Bennett can't tackle to save his life. Decamarion Richardson at least plays with the effort you like to see against the run. So that's my dude. If he wins this job, I'd be a little bit more excited to see where it goes, but still someone that was very raw, was a 4th-round pick for a reason. While he anticipates routes, he can be over-aggressive when doing so and blow his kind of coverage assignment. So you got to find that right balance with him. But I did really like that draft pick. And from a physical standpoint, kind of coming out of Mississippi State, he's very similar to Darius Slay, just strictly speaking in terms of height, length, speed, and the hip fluidity, the change of direction, the foot speed. It's all what you look for in a true number one corner. But just got to work on his consistency and technique. So he's the guy I'm keeping an eye out for. We'll see. And then you're getting into, Sam Webb and 7th-round pick MJ Devonshire territory. Those would be kind of emergency backup type of situations. Devonshire was a tough dude coming out of Pittsburgh, but a long ways away, I think, from starting in the NFL. And I do think they're just going to keep Nate Hobbs, for the most part, in the slot. It's not that he can't play outside. He's almost certainly their best outside corner. But I think for a defense that they want to play a lot of off coverage, they kind of protect these outside corners through the scheme. Nate Hobbs can be in more of an advantageous situation to have good coverage snaps, to get on-ball production, to make an impact against the run by playing in that slot where he's in guys' face a little bit more, as opposed to these, cover 4, cover 3, or cover 2 where they're just playing the flat. They really do protect these outside corners, so the scheme does some heavy lifting here. And by putting Nate Hobbs in the slot, it's a tougher ask that certainly the rest of these guys couldn't do as well as Nate Hobbs does, and would arguably hurt their defense more if they were to flip that. So I like Nate Hobbs. He's frankly saving this from being a D+ grade for the coverage group, whereas it's a C- right now, ranking 29th to 31st, by the way. I didn't say that for the audio-only people. But it's almost fitting that we list the grades then and there, because this safety duo is rather inconsequential for this Raiders defense. I mean, Marcus Epps and Trayvon Merrick at different stages in their career here, but are, in my eyes, effectively the same player. Merrick a little bit more athletic, Marcus Epps a little bit smarter, but the difference isn't significant. They are both solid but unsubstantial run defenders. Both guys will splash a nice play on the ball every week or 3. Both guys will find themselves out of position and lose coverage assignments as well. They're both okay safety starters. Not going to compromise this defense, but not going to elevate it either. The safety depth does have some fascinating names. I really like Chris Smith. Looked good in the one game that the Raiders let him get out there for. You're probably not going to start him over Merrick or Epps, but if one of those guys went down, I wouldn't be stunned if Chris Smith, who's a really heady player with good feet and good just overall football IQ and awareness, wouldn't be surprised if he made some plays and overtook one of those starting jobs long term. Really good tape at Georgia. So I'm going to hold out hope on one of my draft crushes there. Isaiah Polamau has played for this defense on the back end. 6'3" dude out of USC. Hasn't played a ton, but hasn't been a huge issue when he's been out there. So you got a couple good backups that can come in on the back end. Maybe even give you some flexibility to use one of those guys in a dime package as a dime safety. Would love Chris Smith in that role. And then you got Trey Taylor, a 7th-round pick out of Air Force. Total playmaker, loves to hit, good size, good speed, someone to keep an eye on. Kind of emerged late in the draft process, and then everybody that got to him was like, yeah, he's pretty fun. And who doesn't like to root for an Air Force member? So that does round out your secondary. Again, a C- grade, ranking 29th to 31st in terms of DB coverage. Clearly a group that's going to drag down this overall defense that we'll see in a second. And then just a solid B grade in terms of DB run support between Nate Hobbs, Marcus Epps, and Merrick. It's just kind of an average, middle-of-the-road run defense in that giant cluster, ranking 7th to 23rd in terms of run support from the D-backs. So for a team that's great up front, but very questionable in the secondary, it shouldn't be a huge surprise that they rank significantly better in run defense than they do in pass defense. They rank third for me in overall run defense, which would be a huge jump up from last year where they were, I think, about 17th in run defense, but yeah, just added one of the best run defense defensive tackles in the league. So you should see a pretty big spike in your run defense there. But then, 21st in pass defense, basically all pass rush. It can only get you so far. They are mostly counting on scheme and Jack Jones interceptions to make up on the back end. But with ranking third in run defense, you're hoping to force a lot of 3rd and 8 pluses. And that's when you can play some of that off coverage. You can lean on Patrick Graham to cause confusion with the scheming and use stunts and twists up front to get after the quarterback, to blitz. And, of course, let Max Crosby tee off on you, which is never good for an offense. So that's kind of the game plan, is to get to 3rd and 8 and get off the field. I know that sounds obvious, but how many of these teams don't have the types of run defenses that we've talked about for the Raiders, right? So they come out exactly as the middle-ranked defense, the 16th best defense in the league, but the highest graded one we've done so far with a B grade. Kind of makes sense. Great D-line, poor secondary, meet in the middle there with a B grade. But at the end of the day, I do think this is a defense that will have enough games throughout the season where they are able to play with that game script we've talked about, with that 25th ranked offense being more of a ball control, eat the clock, stay ahead of the chains, lean into your playmakers, let Gardner Minshew convert some tough third downs when you need it. But if you have to punt and count on your defense, they're comfortable doing that 5 times a game, especially as we transition to the special teams where they just happen to have the best punter in the league. A.J. Cole, last 2 years, comes out as the number 1 ranked punter in the league. They also have a kicker they can count on. They actually, for the overall special teams grade, only came out tied for 13th once you factored in their PFF team grade and their DVOA team grade from last year. Clearly, their coverage units and return game wasn't up to snuff relative to their kicker and punter, but you do certainly expect a level of consistency when your actual specialists are this good in Daniel Carlson and A.J. Cole. And there's no doubt that that's a compliment to a team that wants to win with this type of game script. So I do like the special teams, even if some of the metrics there pulled them down to more of a league average special teams. I would maybe bet that they overachieve that. But let's wrap up by recapping this team's strengths and weaknesses. Then we'll take a look at their schedule, their over-under, kind of how many wins I think this team will get, and then we will be on our way. But this team might not have the longest list of strengths, but I don't think they have a very long list of weaknesses either. So for the strengths, I do think the offensive line is a strength relative to the rest of the league. It's not the best O-line in the league, but it is top third as we broke down. My favorite thing about this team is probably the weapons and the just pure, clean distribution of skill sets that they have, where everybody has a specific role that should function within this offense. And then the D-line kind of contributing to the pass rush and the run defense. I love how this team is going to be able to dictate things at the line of scrimmage, kind of force teams to play on their own terms, a little bit with the offensive line there, but especially with that defensive line. But as you look at the weaknesses, the overall passing game, specifically when it comes to like the drop back game, is going to be in question. You have a lesser quarterback, whether that's Minshew or Aiden O'Connell, and a play designer in Luke Getsy who has basically everything to prove here this year. So that's going to be a big thing to monitor. And then the secondary, as we broke down, it's a limiting group in terms of really what you can do on the back end. And I think it does require the Raiders play kind of like they did last year in a very specific way with the off coverage and not a lot of man-to-man assignments for those guys. So for that reason, you can end up a little bit matchup dependent, depending if certain teams can take advantage of their play style back there. But let's look at their schedule. It surprised me how hard this schedule is when we just did the Chargers in our last episode, and their schedule was so easy. So I don't know how the Raiders drew such a tough beat here. I mean, their first 10 games are really tough. Their first 2 games are on the road. You have to open at the Chargers. That's obviously a big game. While I rank the Raiders above the Chargers, I think that home crowd's going to be rocking with Harbaugh, taking over, all that. There's some hype for that team, so they're going to be underdogs in that game. Then at Baltimore, that's really tough. You do get to host the Raiders. You get the Broncos week 5, but, man, you got Cleveland, you got Pittsburgh, the Rams, the Chiefs, the Bengals, the Dolphins, all within their first 10 games there. It is going to be a tough run for this team. We mentioned this is the type of team that can drag good teams into the mud and dictate their terms and pull off some upsets. So you're definitely hoping they can do that with some of these teams that they'll be big underdogs against. And then it does open up in the second half of the year where you get to host Denver, you host the Chargers week 18, you get a run of NFC South teams, and you host the Jags. Those are much more winnable games for this team. So maybe a second half run for this Raiders team could be something you predict. They certainly have made a few of those over the years. But it is a tough schedule, and I think that plays into their over-under being so low at 6.5. In terms of how I added it all up, that looks spot on. So if you're pro Raiders, go ahead and take that bet. If you're against the Raiders and want to bet the under there, I would say go for that as well. I'm certainly staying away from this one. I'm more looking forward to watching this Raiders team than I am looking forward to betting on them because they have more of a unique team and a unique play style. But it's a fun team. I'm happy to, Raiders fans will always want more respect, but I'm happy to finally be, I think, pro Raiders. I don't know too many other people that would rank them any higher than 24th. So looking forward to seeing Gardner Minshew and this group of weapons and this pass rush, this D-line going to work. Antonio Pierce is a really fun story. So definitely some optimism for this team. Maybe down the road they can get a quarterback and really start to have some serious conversations about upside. But in terms of floor, it's a good football team, and I hope you guys enjoyed hearing me break them down. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this series or enjoyed this video, please do hit that like button. Let me know in the comments down below where I went right, where I went wrong. Am I too high on this Raiders team? Who do you think comes next in this series? Let me know all of it down below. But until the next deep dive, thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon. Peace out.